In this episode, we dive deep into the underwater world of aquatic animals and the different sustainability problems facing fisheries and aquaculture sectors with Wasseem Emam, the passionate leader of ethical seafood research. In this compelling episode, we explore why our seafood choices matter for ocean health and biodiversity, and the urgent ethical challenges facing both farmed and wild capture seafood operations. Wasseem shares invaluable insights from his years working across the sector as an ecologist and animal welfare researcher, shedding light on innovative solutions and global initiatives aimed at improving the welfare of aquatic life while ensuring sustainable practices for both producers and animals. He outlines tangible steps taken by his team across Africa to drive positive change within both the public and private sectors and to promote the uptake of responsible production practices. With a keen eye on the future, we delve into the evolving landscape of the seafood sector and discuss the current standards of fish welfare, pinpointing crucial gaps that demand attention. But it's not just about identifying problems. We empower listeners with actionable steps to support ethical seafood choices and contribute to a healthier planet. Join us as we navigate through thought provoking discussions on how our food choices impact our own health, the health of the animals involved in the food system, and the overall health of our planet. Wasseem leaves us with a powerful question to ponder daily, igniting a collective journey toward a more compassionate world for all living beings. Plus, stick around for an enlightening addendum where Wasseem shares personal anecdotes and insights into his journey founding ethical seafood research. It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Hello, and thanks so much for joining. I'm very excited that Wasseem Emam, Director and Head of Research at Ethical Seafood Research, joins us today. Hi, Wasseem. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you.
I'm very excited for our discussion. To kick things off, could you tell us a little bit about the story behind founding Ethical Seafood Research and why you chose to focus on the welfare of aquatic animals within the seafood industry?
Yeah, so that's actually a funny one. So I kind of started ESR in a bit of an accidental way, let's say. I was always working on things around sustainability in fisheries, sustainability in aquaculture. That's basically my whole career since university. But then when I worked in the European Parliament in Brussels, just before COVID, I one of my roles in the policy reports that were coming in from consultants that were like working on various topics related to, um, let's say, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture in the European Union. I started thinking, well, actually, I'd much prefer to be doing the work that I'm reviewing as opposed to reviewing the work. And I thought, oh, how do I get into that sort of work? And I contacted some of the consultants that were listed in these reports I was reviewing, and um, they said to me, well, first of all, you have to register as an entity because people take you a lot more seriously as opposed to just an individual. And I just registered a name and, didn't really give it too much thought in the beginning. I thought, well, I know that I like the area of, I know I want to be doing research. I know that, animal welfare is important, sustainability is important, all these different elements. So the word ethical came to mind, but I struggled a bit on the word seafood because I know that, well, I get a lot of sort of criticism from some of animal advocates about, commodifying animals by calling them seafood. But I reminded that actually that does include things like, seaweed, sea cucumbers, and we work on them also just as much as finfish and so on. So that's a bit of the history of the name and how I came up with it. But I have to say that in the beginning, it was just me as a consultant applying for these projects with other consultants. We would bid together, and it was just me. And then I spent some time in Zanzibar earlier last year as part of an effective altruism residency that was like meant to bring the leaders of EA in Africa together to work on projects that were, really important priorities for Africa. And it was then that I really started thinking, well, why don't I, actually give more thought to how I grow as organization and what I can do with my expertise and so on. And I met someone there from Kenya who really encouraged me to grow my team. He came on board and he said to me, well, he was looking for work as he'd just been made redundant working on hen welfare. And he said, well, let's do something on fish welfare in Kenya. And I realized actually Africa is one of the places where there's not much going on at all within fish welfare and aquaculture. And I thought, okay, well, let's focus on there, and things really grew from there. But why did I choose aquatic animals within seafood? So I was already working on, let's say, sustainability. My background is in ecology. I'm an ecologist, an aquatic ecologist. Um, but I never really felt comfortable in industry, and that's where a lot of people end up. Um, so when I learned about animal welfare, it felt like a natural fit for someone who's trying to help animals, but also trying to sort of, let's say, make the industry mitigate some of the worst impacts of industry. Yeah, that's how I came into it. And actually, I will just say about fishes and aquaculture, it's also a question of scale. So there's fish that are affected by, the aquarium trade, what they call the ornamental trade. That's very bad, of course, but the scale compared to, the number of fish that are caught in wild fisheries or aquaculture is much smaller. And then there's also fish used in scientific experiments. Whilst I do care about them, I felt like fisheries and aquaculture is where I could have the most impact. Yeah.
So you're saying when we think about finfish, when we think about sea life, there are a variety of different spaces we need to think about, including ornamental, or what many might think about in terms of fish in aquariums as pets and more. There are certainly fish used in research, and the number is tremendous. However, you felt that you could make the greatest impact focusing on the industry side, and particularly when you think about the food industry. Am I hearing you right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
The food side, the one that could make the most difference. And yeah.
Well, you mentioned focusing on key issues that had not yet been addressed in Africa and beyond. What do you see as some of the most pressing ethical issues facing both farmed and wild capture seafood in operations today?
Yeah. So the word ethical, I think we have to first agree, or at least for ESR, we like to define that we look at it from an animal's perspective, because of course there's ethical things like human trafficking that goes on in the fishing industry, and that's obviously terrible, but we're not working on that right now. That doesn't mean it's not a priority. It's just, we have to obviously all pick our battles. And then there's like labor violations of all sorts happen, and there's environmental issues. So we try to focus on the animal welfare aspect. I think that's what we feel particularly well placed to do and use that lens. So just after defining that, I'd also have to say that farmed animals and wild caught are so different, and the realities are so different. So we have to also spend a bit of time maybe disentangling that when we talk to people about the most pressing issues. So for wild fisheries, one of the big issues, of course, is overfishing. Most of us know that. I hope that most people know that the oceans are experiencing all kinds of threats, and we've fully exploited or overexploited most of the resources, fisheries, let's say, in particular, that are in the ocean. So that's a huge issue, of course, and we need to be giving those fisheries much more of a break than we do. We're operating very close to the limit in many ways. That's a big issue. But then also each gear, when you say fishing, there's so many different ways you can catch fish, and each one has its own ethical concerns, let's say. So if we look at the passive forms of fishing, like long lines, where there's like these huge lines with hooks that are left out, they can actually stretch out for kilometers, and they can be left for a number of days even sometimes. They catch all sorts of animals that they're not meant to catch. That's what they call bycatch. That's a big issue, They can catch marine mammals, for example, and turtles and seals even sometimes. have on the other end of the fishing spectrum, we have things what they call active forms of fishing, like bottom trawling. So of course you have the same issue of bycatch with bottom trawling, but you also have all the habitat destruction that happens because of these nets being dragged along the seafloor, and sometimes sensitive marine habitats. It actually even takes place in marine protected areas in places, even the UK. That's one of the projects or campaigns that we've worked on. So, overfishing, you have bycatch, and then there's things like fishing gear that's used is abandoned and never actually retrieved. It ends up catching more fish. That's a phenomenon they call ghost fishing because it continues to fish. And it's actually quite a large scale problem. That's just maybe, two or three of the big ones that I feel strongly about, at least, that I think ethically make the fishing industry complicated. So that just gives you a flavor. But then aquaculture is completely different. And even within aquaculture, we have to differentiate the species, the type of system. Is it marine? Is it freshwater? Everyone has each case is very different. So I think most people in places like the US and Europe think of aquaculture as these like big, circular cages in the sea, but actually that's a very small proportion of global aquaculture, and most aquaculture is takes place inland in freshwater systems, and mostly these like what they call earthen ponds. Species like common carp and silver carp, catfish, not always species that are eaten so much in the Western world, but these are the ones that are like the biggest scale farming goes on for those species. And of course, tilapia. So tilapia is one of the species that's close to my heart. I consider myself an expert, let's say, somewhat on, tilapia welfare at least, and I feel strongly about how we can improve their lives. But the ethical issues in aquaculture. So, I mean, let's say the big one that people think of a lot is salmon, right? So salmon mostly comes from Norway, Chile, Canada, Scotland. One of the big issues, of course, as these enclosures that they're using get bigger and bigger and bigger, they're fish to be kept in the same place, and it attracts many parasites, but the one that's particularly problematic is sea lice. There's sea lice infestations that come to these salmon, and they actually kill a lot of them. And if they don't kill them, they make them very stressed out, really poor welfare. So one of the solutions that the industry has for that is they use these fish that they call cleaner fish. There's like these wrasse and lumpfish that they use. They remove the lice from the salmon, but in turn, they have a hard time and they struggle and they die, and their welfare is poor in the systems that they're in the salmon farms. So we've kind of used one animal to solve a problem in another animal's farming, which doesn't seem, which seems problematic, let's say, from an ethical perspective. So that's sea lice. Then of course you can't talk about salmon farming or farming of carnivorous animals like salmon without talking about the amount of fish meal and fish oil that goes into the feed that they're fed. So that typically comes from wild fisheries, and it used to be just like byproducts that the industry was catching anyway, but now there's whole industries of fishing vessels that just go out to catch fish that end up being used just to make fish meal, fish oil, and they're mostly being caught in places like Africa, where they're already protein poor countries, places that those countries should be used. If anyone's going to be eating those fish, it really should be them. So there's a number of NGOs doing some great work in that space, but definitely it raises ethical issues. And unfortunately, even substituting fish meal, fish oil, some of the other substitute like soybean has had this criticism because, it requires a lot of land and so on. I'm not an expert on that by any means, but just to give you a flavor of some of the kind of debates that are always raging, fish meal, fish oil, sea lice, with salmon, of course, there's the deterrence they have around salmon farmers to stop, let's say, tuna actually trying to eat the salmon in Norway. That's become a problem. Seals in Scotland are a problem. Sometimes it's dolphins, and they end up having to, either use acoustic deterrence or some places even shoot the animals, which is another ethical issue. So that's marine. I just focused on salmon because it's one that, I think people know that are more familiar with. But if we want to talk more globally of something that affects all types of aquaculture, there's always environmental impact. No farm leaves zero impact. There's always effluent that goes into the surrounding area. There's, fish waste, feed waste. There's escapees of animals from those enclosures that go into the wild, and they can then breed with wild counterparts or compete with them. And I could really list lots of other issues, but it's just to give you a flavor of some of the things that that go on that we feel are the biggest ethical concerns.
And as you mentioned from the beginning, our definition of ethical matters, and you highlighted a number of different ethical issues that involve humans, whether we're thinking about some of the major problems, as you mentioned, related to human rights, human trafficking, as well as questions around who needs and obtains the protein in these conversations. I hear you that for the purpose of our discussion today and for your mission, you're really focused on animals at the core of that ethical conversation, and people are part of it. And when we think about the animals involved, it's not simply exclusive to the finfish or other particular species that we're discussing most directly. And you gave some great examples of how we need to consider other sea life in that conversation, whether we're thinking about predators, others that are affected by bycatch, others that are affected by their environments being damaged. And there's so many layers to what you mentioned, but I want to simply highlight that when we're talking about the choice to eat seafood, right, we may be thinking about factors for that particular dish, that particular order, that particular species. But what I'm hearing from you is it is a far more complex conversation when we're thinking about making sustainable choices, when we're thinking about making ethical choices from a variety of different lenses. And we can't simply think about that one fish or that one meal, because we're also thinking about environmental impact, habitat, other species, other humans, and a variety of different considerations that go into that decision.
And obviously the context, if we're talking about someone in North America versus someone in, some of the parts of the world that we work in is, the very different considerations, like the options available to them, right? So
absolutely,
that's part of the conversation for us. Yeah.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that and helping to provide that context. To your point about your work, let's jump in to that more specifically. Tell us a little bit about how your organization is working to address these challenges.
Sure. So obviously we don't work on all of those things that I mentioned because it's just be too much, I think, for any organization. So we tried to find our niche, and I think I mentioned earlier that, we thought, okay, well, Africa seems to be a place where, this conversation's not really taking place, and we think there are some win-win solutions, and we know farmers are always looking to improve, and because so we talk about extensive versus intensive farming, which is something that was taken from the livestock and terrestrial farming, but it's still very much a conversation within the fish farming world, because many farmers still farm in quite, let's say, basic ways. They not too many inputs and so on. So there's a chance to do things right before things get too crazy. And we have this huge. Well, I don't like to use the word factory farm because it's hard to define that in aquatic systems, but I would say salmon farming is a form of factory farming, and we have a chance to do that better in places that we work. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry. So how do we do that? So our two main focuses are research and education, and that basically means understanding, well, what would stop the farmers in question from implementing better practices? So we try to understand, the challenges they face, the realities they face as well, so that we can think of solutions that are actually appropriate to them and their realities, instead of being like, oh, well, maybe you should feed a bit more because you don't feed your fish enough, but actually we don't know that the price of feed is very expensive, and the reason they're, maybe alternating a daisy feed is because of economic considerations. So that's insensitive to their reality. So we try to tailor things in that way. Yeah.
I was intrigued by your use of the phrase global solutions broker on your website. Can you talk a little bit about what does that mean when you talk about your role in these solutions? What do we mean by global solutions broker, and how are you facilitating this?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of what I was touching upon in that last part, that, so in the 3 or 4 countries that we have active projects right now, we, first of all, we always start with like a baseline survey or stakeholder mapping or some way to figure out, to get a lay of the land, to see, what are the practices, what are the things that people are most concerned about, both from like all stakeholders, not just the advocates and animals rights groups, but also the farmers and the government and so on. So once we've identified those, we then look, okay, well, where are the low-hanging fruits of things that would be good for animals, would be good for people, and sort of we experiment with different approaches. So I can maybe talk a bit about that. But for the feed example that I gave, so instead of just saying, oh, you have to feed more, we can also look at, well, what exactly are they feeding? How often are they feeding? Where in the farm are they feeding? Because that has an impact on how well the fish are fed and so on. And we can improve animal welfare in aquaculture actually sometimes through some fairly simple measures. So when we talk about global solutions broker, I think we mean we see both how the industry approaches things. I believe that most farmers, and I'm obviously talking about small scale farmers here, but in general, I believe that industry does want to do things better if they can, but of course they're thinking about their bottom line. That's important. So they want to see changes. Of course, advocates and lobbyists want to see all sorts of changes too, and the government wants to see changes. So we see ourselves, well, we see both perspective, and how do we keep both happy? And that is a challenge, but one of the things I like about animal welfare is that there are these win-win solutions sometimes, and when you do find them, it can be very, very rewarding. Yeah.
Thank you for walking through that. I know you also work with academics. I want to make sure we don't leave them out of the conversation. You mentioned your emphasis on research. Can you talk a little bit about how you're supporting in that area as well?
Yes. So in most of the places that we're active, one of the first things we do when we do the stakeholder map is we identify who is most likely to understand and be sympathetic to our work, and who is very active, and we partner with them. So in Egypt, for example, we have a university in the heart of the Nile Delta, which is where most of the fish farming happens, that we work closely with them. And we both do capacity building for the students, but we also apply for joint projects to add to their research portfolio, let's say. But we also work with other stakeholders too. So regulators, for example, in Zanzibar, we are working with the Ministry of Blue Economy and Fisheries, and that's sort of a new approach for us. But they told us, well, Zanzibar has been a primarily seaweed farming place, but they know that there is already a desire to move towards farming animals to fish, I should say finfish, and they say, well, they heard about work, and they're like, well, we want to make sure that we do things in the best way from the beginning. So can you help us? And we said, okay, well, let's think about how to develop a strategy, and we've just actually kicked off that project last week. To model basically practices from some of the places that are doing it in the best way already, and things like humane slaughter, can we maybe push them towards other places, and environmental enrichment, that would be ideal, of course. So yeah, we work with all kinds of stakeholders.
I want to circle back on your last point here and delve into this a little bit deeper, because I think you're touching on how you are setting a strategy, how you are defining progress or improvement. And we also know that by many standards, fish welfare and fish research are less developed today than they are for other species. When you think about setting those priorities, when you think about defining success, when you really think about what constitutes good welfare for finfish or other sea life, how do you go about addressing this, given that those gaps, that current state is not where it is today compared to other species?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, and definitely gets to the heart of one of the issues that I think most people in our world or space grapple with. It's true. There's a lot less research carried out on fish and other aquatic animals compared to land animals, especially animal welfare, especially, I mean, if you look at terrestrial, like farm animal welfare, cows, pigs, chickens, they've been, researched for so much longer. There's so many more papers about, the kind of enrichment you can provide them. And we're definitely always learning from them. And I would say several steps behind. But in the same way, we also have the advantage, by the way, that, we learn from the pitfalls that they have, the struggles that they've had, for example, with cage-free farming. There are lessons to be learned there. But I think one of the biggest issues with aquatic animals is that, so people say fish, but what is fish? I mean, there's just aquaculture alone, there's 400 species of fish that are farmed around the world, right? So, it's not like pigs or chickens or cows. There's a lot more animals. So not only are they already behind in terms of research and stuff, but there's also a lot more to learn because each animal is completely different. What might work for carp might not work for sea bass or sea bream, for example. And it does make things a bit more tricky. The approach that we take, and I think many researchers take, or scientists in that context, is the precautionary principle. For example, just because we don't know for sure that all aquatic animals feel pain, it doesn't mean we shouldn't assume they do. So just to give you an example, it's not because they have a nervous system or a vertebrate or they're vertebrates or whatever that they do or don't feel pain. And research, there was groundbreaking research from London School of Economics a few years ago that showed that decapods and crustaceans can feel pain. So that's obviously one of the approaches that we take. But then I would say that the golden rule for aquatic animals when it comes to standards is that it has to be species specific. You can't just say, this stocking density works for this fish, so it will work for another. I think it has to be tailored to them. Otherwise, it risks actually sometimes making things worse. So some fish actually like to be stocked at higher densities because otherwise there's aggression between species. And so you asked me about good welfare. What does good welfare look like? Or
Essentially, how you're tackling these challenges, how you're defining success. And if I'm hearing you right, it is complex and perhaps more complex than it is for many species in the sense that there are over 400 species to consider with aquaculture alone. So part of what you're doing is getting very specific in terms of the species that you're focusing on and not making assumptions from one species to another. Another piece that you're focused on is really learning from what evidence there is in terms of issues that have been addressed for land animals within factory farming and other systems, and drawing lessons from those, whether those are scientific frameworks, whether those are particular practices that you see parallels between fish and land animals and more, and also recognizing where the industry or where particular farming practices could be going, anticipating those issues and working with collaborators from all of these different spaces to essentially set good practices from the beginning where possible and work to mitigate issues that already exists today, even with a lack of research or evidence compared to other species. So all that align with
Yeah.
what you see as key priorities?
And actually, that's the next thing I was going to say is that where there's not enough science, we look at, is there comparables we can get from other species, even though it's not ideal, is sometimes, the best starting point. But there are some generalities across all species, for example, like the suitable environment, all animals need a suitable environment. And, water quality parameters, they'll be different for each species, but there's some things that we know if we had to pick some to start with, dissolved oxygen is always going to be an important one for any aquatic animal. So you always start with like the bare bones that will how they talk about negative welfare and positive welfare. So with the negative welfare, we know there are some things that are stressors. So we're just trying to reduce the most stressful things, like a lack of oxygen, like a very high stocking density, like not lack of feed or underfeeding, let's say. Yeah, so we try to work with the things that we know for sure are likely to be causing issues where the science is not there yet.
Certainly makes sense. And when you're thinking about these particular areas where there is a lack of a clear protocol or a particular standard, how do you and your team go about addressing that? When you think about evaluating the practices that are in use, and let's stick with the stress example, the particular impact on a particular species and that species' experience of stress. How do you navigate the gap?
Yeah, so I mean, animal welfare science, one of the issues is that it's not exact science. It's like kind of a bit of a mixture of different fields that have to come together. So there's always a degree of ambiguity. But best practice dictates that when there's a lack of clear protocols for one species, okay, let's talk about welfare assessments at least, right? So there are things that we know, even people always confuse production and welfare, right? So just because a fish is growing doesn't mean it's doing well. It just means it's doing well enough to grow. So we see just innate basic necessities that they need, the fish's basic needs. But if you're, lacking any evidence or scientific literature to back up, there's no indicators, let's say, that exist for that species, the next best thing would be to look at what production parameters. So there's things like growth rate, there's things like, they can dissect fish and look at the liver, the weight of the liver comparison to the weight of the fish at the index there. There's a condition index, it'd be like BMI in fish that can tell you, the overweight, underweight. And then there's a feed conversion ratio to see how efficient the farm's production parameters are, like how much feed they're putting in versus the fish's the output they get from the farm. These are all telling you how the farm is doing, and they're not great for welfare at all, but sometimes they're all we have. But also water quality is is usually some tests that's all species will have some studies have done on them to show that below this they die. So we have that to work with. And I was thinking of the example of cortisol. There's usually tests that you can do where to test for cortisol levels in water to show stress, but that's a bit pricey and there's some kind of technical issues. So I tend to stay away from it. If we're really lacking any protocols at all, we go for what we know are like kind of safe bets, like growth and obvious signs of disease, like fin erosion, like scales missing. That's clearly not, regardless of the species, that can't be a good indicator of good welfare. Yeah.
I want to circle back on an example you had shared earlier that really resonated with me and also ties back to the recent podcast discussion with Dr. Fritha Langford. And that had to do with the issue of lice and the solution in practice to bring in a cleaner fish, and yet that cleaner fish's welfare may not be part of the conversation or may not be as much of a priority. Whether we're thinking about how you've addressed that particular issue or that type of challenge where we're essentially widening the lens of animal welfare considerations, how would you go about addressing that, particularly in this case where many may view that approach as a solution, and the concept of also considering the welfare of that cleaner fish may not have been a priority until your team is involved?
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one. So the RSPCA in the UK, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which were one of the first to create a welfare standard for salmon, they correctly recognized that cleaner fish are a concern and need to have their welfare considered. And they now have some requirements in their standard for how to look after cleaner fish better, and not just because actually they were just leaving them to die. They were putting more in, and there was absolutely no care at all. But now there's more protocols in place. The good thing about RSPCA is that they, so at least in Scotland, where the scheme is from, or the UK, almost all the farms are certified. So whenever they come up with something, we know that basically the industry is doing it because they all adhere to their standards. They're kind of like setting a minimum bar where government has failed, unfortunately, because government's standards are too low or not ambitious enough, and that's where certifiers come in, right? So that's an example of, I'm thinking of lumpfish in particular, which are the main ones that are used in Scotland. But actually, when you were saying that, I was thinking of insects, so there's a lot of people in the aquaculture industry think of insects as part of the solution to feed. They're like, oh, they're used already. Is it called insect meal? I believe the official word is, that they make protein out of them and they add them to fish feed. And we don't know anything about insects. We know even less about them and their welfare and their sentience and all that. So, it's a murky water to get into to start, extending farming to them. So that was one thing that came to mind when you said that. And of course, there are farms that farm fish to be used for fish meal, not just wild capture fisheries. So, I was actually thinking about tuna farming. So one of the projects I've worked on and was quite close to my heart is bluefin tuna. So, or we could talk about all kinds of tuna, but bluefin tuna is particularly fascinating because these are like large animals. They migrate across huge distances in the ocean, and they're called the tigers of the sea because they're apex predators. They're very carnivorous. And they used to be wild caught, and it was mostly, small industry used for the sashimi trade. But as global appetite for sashimi grade tuna expanded, and the whole industry grew of farming tuna. It used to be just they catch the juveniles from the wild, and then they fatten them or ranch them, or put them in ranches. But now they've actually closed the cycle on that, and they can breed juveniles in captivity. However, actually we haven't talked about this at all, but there's all kinds of ethical issues. Like a number of fish that die in these systems is really high. It's very experimental, and you can only really feed tuna not live, a whole fish. They've tried to create pellets and feed for them, but the solutions so far are not sufficient or good enough, and they rely on feeding the whole fish. And actually, there are farms that are supplying them, and there's some various examples of that. But yeah, it's like doesn't feel like we're really solving the problem by creating more problems, right? And
when you describe this, what I'm hearing is that this example alone is illustrative of so many of the challenges you've been talking about, as well as many of the rationale for why to the earlier podcast discussion with Dr. Elliott Swartz that industry and other collaborators are now focused on cell-based agriculture, and we could certainly expand that to say cell-based aquaculture or cell-based fish, sea life, because when we think about the challenges, number one, there are efficiency concerns. And to your point about farming fish for the sake of feeding other farmed fish in and of itself, there are efficiency issues there. When we think about the welfare of all involved, there are certainly illustrative examples of why this is problematic for the bluefin tuna, as well as presumably for the fish being fed to the bluefin tuna. And the alternatives, whether small in number or not, when we think about wild caught, when we think about your point about the evolution of the industry from ranching to farming, all of these are fraught with animal welfare considerations. So certainly from the beginning, I know you mentioned that you're not only focused on fit fish, that you're also focused on sea life, whether we think about seaweed or other products. I would certainly welcome any thoughts or feedback you have when we think about broadening that conversation and we think about alternatives that offer improvements, even if they are in development and not yet a full alternative today, such as cell-based options. It certainly seems directly relevant from what you're describing. And we know that there has been at least some interest in investment in that area. But when I'm hearing you walk through all of these issues, that's where my mind is going is, yes, there are problems being created to solve or attempt to solve this problem. And we have to think about all of these layers when we think about alternatives and solutions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I didn't touch upon it, but I do believe that alternative proteins, which is obviously a big category, it has to be part of the solution. So like you said, cell-based, there are options already for cell-based seafood that are promising. Tuna, I think, is an easy one, because it's a high-end luxury product. Do we really need to be doing that to these animals? That seems like low-hanging fruit, let's say. And I was also actually thinking, as you were saying that another topic close to my heart is caviar. A lot of people don't talk about caviar, but people don't even know where caviar comes from, I think, mostly, but it comes from these fish, sturgeon fish, which are like dinosaurs of the sea. They've been around for ages. They're long-lived. They live for a long time. They're absolutely fascinating animals, and they're just used for, their eggs, which seems, tragic. And also, it also seems like a really like there's no argument for food security when it comes to something like, caviar. It's just like something you put on top. It's a bit like foie gras, which seems really excessive. So I think we could do away with that. And I think that's something that, cell-based alternatives are likely to, there already are some promising advancements there. I think I've read something about caviar alternatives. Taste is similar. So I think we can probably, just replace that practice altogether. But also, like, not just cell-based meat. I'm thinking of the other one, like what's that company? There's a California company that does a tuna, but actually tastes very similar to tuna, not just like cell culture, but there are alternatives like that, which I think are very promising, especially for high-end products, salmon, tuna, caviar. Maybe not realistic in the short term for some of the other animals, but I would personally love to see us make much faster progress towards that.
We can make sure that we've got links to any of these products that we want to highlight for listeners included with the podcast. And as a quick summary, I certainly agree when we think about luxury products, when we think about people's willingness to pay for the products you mentioned and more, there are cell-based options. There are also some alternatives, whether plant-based or looking at other options within the alternative protein category that at least provide some improvements when we think about animal welfare, sustainability, and more. And when we think about innovation and improvement, recognizing there is complexity, to your earlier point about all the different species, and as you mentioned from the beginning, there are low-hanging fruit. And one way to think about low-hanging fruit are these very severe animal welfare challenges, severe problems to sustainability and ocean life. And in any of these cases, as someone that wasn't always vegan, I think we can focus on a particular facet of selecting a choice of what to eat. And we may think that we're addressing a problem because one option is more sustainable than another, or we have preconceived notions or some level of information about one trade-off versus another. What I really appreciate about this conversation is you're illuminating how many layers need to be factored in with any of these different decisions, as well as what we define as improvement and alternatives, and how we achieve improvement across these issues and more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I was just realizing, by the way, that we haven't even talked about shrimps, which is the food category that affects the most number of animals, of course. There's like trillions, I think, of numbers of shrimps that are killed each year for food. And I don't really know much about alternatives, plant-based alternatives to them that apparently are quite good. But I don't think enough people are talking about that issue really, and we think of them. I don't say we, but people tend to think of them like insects or of the sea or something. But we know that they're sentient, and we know that they suffer in the conditions that they're kept in, and the scales are atrocious, and even more every day you see more reports of like these the way they treat the workers in these farms and in the processing plants to peel, like these women in India that are peeling these shrimp to make sure that people in the West are getting these peeled shrimp. To me, that's a whole other ethical issue, and I feel like I don't see it being talked about enough. But another layer of complexity, let's say.
Absolutely. When we think about the human side of the conversation, appreciate that you've mentioned from the beginning that there are so many issues, and we may have greater awareness of some of those human rights challenges or some of those workplace issues in some industries and not others. And I would say from my own vantage point, there's not enough conversation about these issues and more in the food industry and the spaces we're talking about. And when we think about the sentient side of the conversation, it applies to insects, it applies to any species. And I really appreciate the point you made earlier. I want to echo it again, that my interpretation of your comment extends beyond fish, that we need to assume species are capable of pain. And that even if there is a lack of evidence today that a particular species experiences pain, or even experiences pain to the degree other species do, that's not a reason to exclude that species from an animal welfare conversation. There are particular nuances when it comes to prioritization, when it comes to thinking about the species specific animal welfare lens that we may need to factor in. So for instance, an example I talk about often is octopus, incredibly brilliant species, which we have benefited from documentaries and other recent research to help elevate, that in many cases is compared to a young child. And that matters when we think about some of the recent advancements as I see them in the US in terms of banning things like octopus farming because of the major challenges that those types of farms would raise, given how brilliant octopus are. That does matter. And two things can be true. We also need to make sure that we are not excluding species from the animal welfare conversation, from animal welfare frameworks, simply because they may not have that level of cognitive ability, or there is not that evidence of pain. We need to include all species in those animal welfare considerations, including insects and including species that are not insects, but may get compared to insects. I really appreciate everything that you've highlighted there.
Actually, can I intervene just because you said about octopus? It really brought, obviously, I keep thinking of things we haven't brought up, because there are so many different facets of the sector and the industry. And I'm very supportive, of course, of all the efforts that people are doing to highlight, how brilliant octopus are. But the part for me about farming that I don't get is that, of course, we shouldn't be farming these animals, I personally believe, but we shouldn't be catching them or eating them anyway. I mean, I'm saying all this about caviar, but like, we don't, it's not a security issue, that's a bit of a delicacy, it seems like one of these really unnecessary things. So, practices, and so some people ask me, like, what can we do to improve the state of, fisheries and aquaculture? And one thing they say, well, what about these, like, un unnecessary practices, or unnecessarily cruel, but also I just don't see any need for it. The wild capture of octopus is also very brutal and horrible and unsustainable, and involves labor violations and other human issues too. So even farming aside, I still feel like it's one of these aspects that kind of troubles me, let's say. Yeah.
I'm absolutely with you. I so appreciate you saying that. I just try to preface this conversation acknowledging I am vegan, and I wasn't always vegan, and trying to talk about any positive improvement for the well-being of people, animals, and the planet as being the focus. And I absolutely agree. There are species, there are practices, there are any number of different facets to this conversation that we can have a much broader discussion on. Is this necessary? What is the benefit? And to exactly where you started the conversation, our ethical framework may influence that answer, whether we're thinking about a utilitarian framework or we're optimizing for the greatest good. I think everything you just said could suggest what is the actual benefit of this practice compared to the costs, both in terms of animal welfare, human rights, and well-being, and more. I really greatly appreciate you mentioning that, and just want to further emphasize those points for those listening, because I think we can raise that question with any part of this conversation. And what I really hope listeners take from any conversation about food, including and especially this one, is that we have an opportunity to make choices. If we follow 3 meals a day, then at least 3 times a day, that we can not only benefit ourselves, but we can benefit sustainability, the planet, and animals. And these questions matter. There's a great reflection and meditation of sorts as we think about choices that we get an opportunity to make multiple times a day.
It's true. Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to delve into a bit more on a positive success story. So you've shared some examples of the kind of work that you do and focusing on unconventional solutions. If you share an example that just resonates with you deeply, that you find a lot of meaning in, where you were able to achieve some measurable improvement for your collaborators?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I sometimes struggle with the word innovation, but sometimes innovation can be simple things. So one of our close collaborators and partners is FAI Farms, which is a UK and US based, what's the word? I mean, they're a consultancy, but they're for profit, but they work with farmers, both chicken, fish, across multiple species to make improvements. And animal welfare is one of the areas close to their heart. And they developed an app that helps farmers basically assess the welfare of their fish and shrimps and other species too. But the one that I work with them is tilapia in particular. So we're their official implementing partner in Egypt for their tilapia welfare app. And in the beginning, I was a bit skeptical, like, oh, how are farmers going to receive this? We have some issues with literacy in areas, and now we're asking them to like kind of, use its technical solutions. But actually, it was received really well by many of the people we worked with, and they've wanted to see more features being added, for example, a feed calculator for some of the more advanced or, larger scale farmers that they can use to make sure their feeding practices are right. And they're even telling us, okay, how can you make this an even better tool, about introducing a feature that tells them about the price of fish that day, which means that they can, economically also the tool as opposed to just, seeing it as like, this is something that you need to do for the animals. But we always have to pitch in a way that they see the benefit to them as well. But the app is simple to use. It's yeah, so user friendly and it doesn't require internet connection. And it's actually also a very good way for them to. One of the things that they frequently farmers complain about is that the fish are dying. We don't know why they're dying. They call a vet or they call a pharmacist to help them, and they never have a record of, just kind of how many fish were dying yesterday or what, weather conditions are like or whatever. And the app really, I don't know, not forces them, encourages them to keep better records of their practices. And what they're finding is that when they have issues, then they can, whoever's helping them can go, well, obviously this happened some weeks ago, and you didn't realize that that's actually what's leading to you having this kind of issue. And we've been really happy with the uptake among farmers of that tool. And we're still early in that project, but I can see more and more success coming out of that partnership that we've created and working in other countries as well. We hope to replicate that. Yeah, that's something we're very proud of.
A great example, really measurable improvement, as you mentioned, immediately demonstrable impact for the people and the economics and the record keeping, as well as being able to use that data to improve the care and well-being of the animals.
Yes, actually, I was just thinking because I think earlier you asked me about like how we know that we're successful, and I feel like I never actually answered that. But can I take a minute to answer it?
Absolutely.
So it is hard. It's a really hard question, especially with, things like when you're working with fish farmers. I keep going back to fish farmers, even though it's not the only thing we do, but it is a lot of what we do. You'll tell them, okay, try, changing this practice, and they'll expect to see immediate improvements. But sometimes it takes, months within a production cycle. At the end, the cycle, they've actually noticed, oh, well, yeah, we've had less, mortalities or disease outbreaks than previous cycle, or they start doing things differently, and the next year they see benefits from having, treated their land a bit better, let's say, like left it to dry for longer so that diseases don't prevail. There's simple practices. So we go by farmer feedback a lot, and we see the more people come to us, we're less having to go to people and more people are coming to us, which means we must be doing something right, because farmers are typically not the easiest bunch to work with in that sense. But then for things like policy work, which is what we're doing a bit, like I mentioned, in Zanzibar this year, that's harder to implement. It'll be interesting to see, do people follow the strategy in 5 years' time when it comes to check-in? Have things gone according to how we imagined, or how do we readjust? So that'll be a new learning experience for us. But at least for the on the ground stuff, it's a bit of intuition and also, sorry, now I was going to say we have a team on the ground that visits these farms regularly, so they can see for themselves. They take measurements. Has water quality improved? Are farmers reporting less diseases, and how is overall production, and are people happy? So that's what I would have added earlier.
the ongoing relationships, the on-the-ground work, the quantifiable progress, drawing on these other frameworks where needed. Absolutely makes sense. And it sounds like it's an ever-evolving process, that as you learn more, you continue expanding that definition, and you're also tailoring that success based on where that particular farm or that particular collaborator is in their process and the specific species that you're focused on.
Every country is different. Even region is different. In some places, in some countries that we work, like they're really advanced in their practices, and other places are less. And the environment that they work in creates different solutions, realities. Sorry. So, for example, Kenya, their soils are actually so porous that they don't retain water very well. So trying to farm fish in a pond in a place like Kenya, you lose a lot of water to the soil in a year, and it becomes actually it affects the economic equation, let's say. So they use these liners in their ponds, like these kind of polythene sheets to line the ponds, which solves that problem. But then from an animal welfare perspective, actually, one of the nice things about ponds that we always say that tilapia are, if you have to eat one species, tilapia are one of the somehow better, actually you've removed this substrate that they have. They love the substrate. So it's a bit of a shame in that sense. But I was just giving an example of like how every country has different realities. They have predators like birds that eat their fish in places like Kenya as well. We don't have that so much in Egypt, because the migratory paths for pathways for birds don't pass over the fish farming area so much. So yeah, it's just about understanding where you're working and the realities and so on.
Makes sense. Thank you for walking through that example. Looking ahead, you mentioned earlier that we not only have some level of consumer awareness on the rise, and that there's still much to do in terms of knowledge sharing. And we also know we're at least starting to see a demand or interest in ethically sourced food, including seafood.
Yeah.
How do you see the market evolving?
Yeah, so I think it depends which market you're looking at, of course. So one thing that's been very interesting in the, again, aquaculture sector is that something like electrical stunning of fish, shrimps even, seemed unfathomable some years ago. More and more retailers, I'd say, are the ones really driving that change, are saying, nope, all of the seafood in our supply chain needs to have been electrically stunned, farmed, I mean. And we're also seeing a bit of that interest now in wild-caught seafood. In Norway, for example, a lot of the fish that they catch, they have these like onboard stunners. They don't do it for animal welfare reasons, particularly, even though that's a side benefit. There is some understanding of that, and there's some really exciting projects going on there in that sense, in that space. But consumers are demanding it there, from a quality perspective, but also ethically.
Can you unpack that real quick, just for listeners that may not be as aware? When we're talking about stunning, why does that connect to the conversation on quality, and why does that connect to the conversation on animal welfare?
Yeah, so the theory is that maybe backtrack. Okay, let's look at aquaculture first. So normally at the end of a production cycle, the fish are ready to be harvested. I say fish, but let's say whatever aquatic animal is being farmed. The time comes, they, if it's a pond, they're lowering the water level to prepare for that. They stop feeding. They and they remove the fish and usually using nets or pumps or whatever. Usually they just put them directly onto ice. Ice is the most common way of, well, it is slaughter, but we call it asphyxiation or torture, because that's not really slaughter. I mean, it is, you're killing them, but they are, it cannot be a pleasant experience. So that's a typical way that's done in most places around the world. except for salmon farming, Scotland, Norway, and I think Canada has a bit of that, but that they now have, a lot more one form of stunning before being put on ice or being bled or like having a gills cut. They either manually like percussive stunning, like a bit like what these bolts that they use in terrestrial farming, or electrically stunning them on these like conveyor belts. There's dry and there's wet stunning, and that is a much more humane way of slaughtering the fish, so that they're in not conscious when they're slaughtered. Yeah, so that's something that comes from aquaculture, but now we're seeing it a lot more, and the conversation is actually extending to wild caught fisheries, which is, I think, very exciting, because it seemed, some years ago just unfathomable to think that, these massive fishing vessels could actually be bringing it on board. But because of the quality, oh, sorry, so you asked me about quality, right? So in the fish's final moments, or in whatever animal is being farmed or captured, the more stressed they are, the more lactate goes into their muscles, and that causes rigidity, and that can have affect palatability and flavor, and especially discerning consumers. So things like the sashimi market, they really care about the way that the fish are caught for that trade, let's say. So there is a relationship between stress and or like capture stress, harvest stress, let's say, and fillet quality in case of fish, or I don't even know what the word is for like shrimps and other animals, but there's the relationship there. Yeah.
So just as we've talked about these conversations and the level of practice, the animal welfare considerations, as well as awareness on the connection between the quality related factors and the animal welfare factors, can differ dramatically between species, and certainly whether we're thinking about land animals and sea life, that the question of a good death is certainly still a question when it comes to many, many species of fish and sea life. And part of that involves the way that they are killed, the time involved. And as you mentioned, simply placing them on ice, which has been standard practice in many spaces for a very long time, we know is not a pleasant experience, irrespective of some of the other questions around pain indicators across species, because it's essentially asphyxiation. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, as you were saying that, I was thinking, how can we talk about a good death without even talking about a good life as well? Which is because you're asking me about like consumers demanding it and consumer awareness. And I was just telling you one of the things I'm excited about, that, something like humane slaughter might be something that we actually see as like standard. I didn't imagine that some years ago, and now it seems like, oh, it might actually happen. It's already happening, let's say. But a good life, more and more, of course, consumers are demanding that, which translates. And I was going to say certifiers are a big part of that conversation. We're seeing certifiers constantly up their requirements, and there are things that we had asked them for that we thought were not doable, and not like humane slaughter. So they are now Aquaculture Stewardship Council, which I worked for at some point before starting my own seafood. They were so resistant to bringing in to mandating that any farm they certify has to be slaughtering their fish and or aquatic animals in a certain way. And even now they've brought that in, and they're phasing it in, and that's, I think, really progressive. Yeah.
Absolutely. When we think about this discussion from a consumer lens, what steps can consumers take today to support better seafood choices, whether we're thinking about all the lenses when we talk about ethical seafood choices, we think about sustainability, we think about animal welfare and more. What can
Yeah.
consumers do?
Yeah, so that's a very good question as well, and one that we get asked a lot, and one that I think does depend is, what options you have, where you are, and I think it's a bit of a privilege, I think, to have some choices, let's say, that we have to also recognize. But if, certified is I do have some, concerns about certification schemes, so I don't always say certified is better, but it gives us some indication. They're more likely to be less bad, at least for the aquaculture species. Marine Stewardship Council for wild caught fish is generally okay, avoid some of the worst examples of wild caught fish. But I think some of these seafood guides you get, like, so in the US, I think it's Seafood Watch that there's a big one, but in the UK, it's Marine Conservation Society. They have the Good Fish Guide. That's much more, informative. It tells you, like, it's a quick, guide. Okay, this species, red means avoid, green means good. That's a quick way to, if you really need to eat seafood or want to eat it, that's one way of, having a reference. But personally, I would say, if we could all eat much lower trophic aquatic animals, like, mackerel, for example. Mackerel are much more abundant. No one likes, they everyone wants to eat, the more fancy, salmon, tuna, this, but mackerel are actually very healthy compared to some of these other fish. If you have to eat fish, I mean. There's sardines, there's all these, like, what used to be considered poor man's fish, but they're much more sustainable choices. They're much more plentiful. I hate to use the word renewable, but their populations do regenerate much faster. And we would be solving the issue of all these other fish being farmed to eat, like them being used to feed other fish. That would be one way of solving that issue, I would say. And then herbivorous fish are always a better choice. So tilapia, which are actually omnivorous, but they can live on a plant-only diet, are going to be better than some of these more top level predators. And well, I guess maybe cell-based stuff is too soon, but I'd really like to see more people going for those, and plant-based alternatives if possible.
As you mentioned,
Yeah.
plant-based alternatives exist today, so we'll include some of those links. And yes, continuing to support as best we can the advancement of cell-based options.
And sorry, I just wanted to say, like, especially these, like, egregious examples like caviar, like, ask yourself, a bit, did you really need to? If you actually realize just how much these sturgeons suffer in the production of that, maybe I think most people will feel differently when they really know. And, like, octopus, like we talked about, and um, bluefin tuna is another good example. So avoiding those, like, clearly egregious examples, I think, is a good place to start. You don't have to be, go for the most ethical and the most extreme version of that. You can start small, at least, is what I wanted to say.
And ask that question, do I really need this option? Yes. And I think earlier in the conversation, you had mentioned bluefin tuna, caviar, and sturgeon, also including octopus in that example, and more. And I'm excited to check out some of these resources in more detail and see what they have to say about these species. So we'll make sure we're including those links. So leveraging those resources to help speed and inform that process, and really asking yourself, do I need this option? Right? Are there better options? Absolutely.
Actually, Erin, so you have a minute? I just thought of two things. One thing that's very interesting to share with our listeners is that more and more chefs nowadays, some Michelin-starred restaurants are turning away from salmon. Even salmon, which was, seen as like this, holy grail, or like, sort of, so nutritious. More and more people are seeing, like, I'm saying from the food industry, not just, nutrition and so on, they're saying, nope, it's not a good product. So it's interesting to follow some of the trends there, and it'll be interesting to see, you know, where salmon was seen as, this really nutritious option. I think we're, slowly starting to see that differently. And I was going to mention that supplements. People always talk about, omega-3s and all this, and I guess this is something close to your heart. You know a lot more than me about this, but there are plant-based alternatives for all of those, which are very good, like algae oils and stuff that could be just as good as, the krill and all this other stuff. But yeah, sorry, I think you were going to say something when I jumped in.
Great points. No need to apologize. Yes, to everything you just said, in terms of turning away from salmon, one recent resource that I found particularly illuminating on this is the Netflix series You Are What You Eat. The twin study shows some very detailed imagery and walks through particular factors and actually shows those involved in selecting what they're going to serve from a restaurant perspective, saying no to salmon from a variety of different lenses. When it comes to the piece around supplements, really appreciated you highlighting throughout this conversation that this is not just about ordering whole fish. This is about fish feed. This is about the broader ecosystem. And this includes supplements like fish oil and omega-3s, which may not even just be considerations for ourselves, but also our families, our pets, and more. For me personally, I've been very grateful for years to have had easily available vegan, fully plant-based omega-3 supplements. Mine are DHA and EPA based, and I'm happy to include some links to those as well. And there are quite a few options out there. So this seems to be a growing category. And yes, I 100% support the point that through any of these decisions, there are plant-based options, and we'll include some of those. I imagine there are even more than what we've touched on today, but always highlight that any increase in plant-based choices helps our own health, helps animals, helps the planet. And there's so many opportunities to do so, including all of the different decisions we've talked about today. When you think about your next steps as a leader and from the organization, what are some additional goals or projects that you're focused on that we haven't yet touched upon?
Yeah, it's a good one. So I did touch upon a little bit about this humane slaughter and how, we can see that coming in. But what I'm excited about with humane slaughter is actually we managed to get funding to try out that, bringing in electrical stunning to Egypt for a starter within Africa. It's the first place it's ever been done within a continent. And, I'm a bit terrified just about all the potential things that can go wrong, but our funder has been quite generous in allowing us to, try, and if we fail, we fail. But that has the potential to be very impactful. I think we're working with some really good people on the ground, who the industry will take seriously, and we have thought of a good mechanism for multiple farmers to use the same machine when they come to catch their comes to market their fish. And if we can get that scheme off the ground, I think that'll be really, really exciting and something we can roll out to other places. And I think the thing about humane slaughter is, or electrical stunning, is that it's a bit of a low-hanging fruit that we know that we can improve that part. If nothing else during their lives, at least we can give them a good death. And that's why I think, I feel a bit more less ambivalent about it and more sort of certain that this is a good thing. And we're also trialing a certification scheme for smaller scale producers. Normally these schemes are for large farms that get the labels that can afford the labels, but we're trying something smaller, like within like locally, that we they all join together, and there's a operative type system which pushes them and motivates them, encourages them to better practices, let's say, higher welfare practices, better environmental practices, and so on. And that's something we haven't tried before, but we're working with consultants who have had really good success elsewhere, and we think that that might be the right time for places like North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we're very excited about those two possibilities this year.
It actually broke up just a bit. Just want to make sure I'm highlighting your key points. So
Oh,
cooperative system that brings everyone together. So you're helping to bring them in a community and supporting one another and collaborating and addressing some of those lacks of certification that you mentioned earlier.
because
That
normally it's unaffordable for smaller scale. The thing is, the majority of farmers are small scale, but they're the ones that are forgotten about. So the certifiers, they usually go for the big players, but actually, we need something for the smaller scale. So we're thinking, one of these cooperative something run by cooperatives. So it's by them for them, but we help them design it. Yeah. Hopefully that came through that time.
absolutely. And if I'm hearing your key point to the earlier example, rolling out electrostunning has its technical facets, has operational challenges, and given the current state of lack of electrostunning, it's absolutely imperative to move forward despite these potential challenges, because you see very little risk from improving animal welfare for the species involved, and it's worth those trade-offs in terms of bringing this at scale and navigating the complexities of the process.
I mean, if you do it right, there's very little risk of making things worse as opposed to some of the other practices, which actually, sometimes can backfire. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Makes sense. How can listeners, potential collaborators and stakeholders learn more, contribute to, or support these efforts?
Yeah, so I mean, we are a nonprofit, and so the work we do on the ground, especially in Kenya and soon Egypt, will be a nonprofit as well. So we're always obviously open to any donations that people feel like they want to contribute. We're always appreciative of that. But aside from that, of course, we love to bang on about, like the message of, aquatic animal sentience and, raise awareness about that so people can inform themselves. That's, I think, a big part of our work, that we've succeeded in our work, I think, in our mission. And on that note, I wanted to share with your listeners about an exciting initiative we're working on this year. It's a bit different to everything else we've been doing. So we have an activity book on aquatic animal welfare coming out. This almost will be released next month, actually, so I can pass the link as well to be included. That activity book is for, all ages really, but, it takes you through some of the challenges that aquatic animals face, in the wild, in fish, in aquaculture settings. What about shrimps? What about octopus? What about marine mammals? And each one is like fun games, quizzes, Sudoku, some crosswords, some like coloring activities and stuff, which I'm really excited about. I think it's something different, and we had the opportunity to work with some great illustrators. So we're really, really excited to see how that's received in the coming months. So
It's exciting.
if definitely, that's a shameless self-plug there.
I definitely want to get that out there. And we know that coloring at any age can be helpful for our own well-being. So I'm hearing this as great for listeners, whether on the younger or any age. And when it comes to other ways to stay in touch with your organization, you are on social media. How can people follow you, engage with you, get in touch if they want to learn more?
So we're on all platforms except TikTok for now. But, I think LinkedIn is our main one. That's just where our audience seems to mostly be. So, we're very responsive on LinkedIn, and we appreciate any reshares of our content and interactions. And we try to post relevant stuff, educational, material, not just, promoting our own activities and so on. And we're also on Twitter or X, and Facebook. Do you want the links, or do you usually just put them in?
We'll include those all. Yes, just want to make sure that your preferences are highlighted for those that want to get in touch.
Lovely. And also, I was going to say, we're always, interested in collaborations, and we have, on our website, like a link that says, if you're interested in work with us, reach out. And, even though we don't have open opportunities right now, we always keep people's CVs on file. And when things come up, we're interested. Or, volunteers and so on, we're always willing to, there's always there's no shortage of a need for good people, let's say, and who are passionate about the mission. Yeah.
Fantastic. So while there are not open positions today, you're always looking for those to follow, to learn more, to engage with your content, to reach out if interested in volunteering, and essentially to keep learning and sharing this message and putting these questions into practice for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wasseem. This has been an insightful, inspiring conversation, and I'm excited to see the responses. So for those listening, please feel free to reach out and share your thoughts and comments. We'd love to hear from you. And Wasseem, thank you so much for your time today.
Guys, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to discuss some of the issues that we're most passionate about. So thank you for giving us the opportunity, and we look forward to seeing how everyone reacts.
I do too. And thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate all of your thoughts and insights. So I'm pausing to reflect at the end of our conversation here. Wasseem and I realized that we moved through our initial question faster than intended. We had some more to discuss in terms of ethical seafood research. So Wasseem, want to circle back. When you think about the story of why you chose to found Ethical Seafood Research and why you chose to focus on the welfare of aquatic animals within the seafood industry, tell us a little bit about your motivations and how you navigated this path.
Okay, so sorry, Erin, it's just because if now we're doing this as an additional thing, then can I assume that people know what I said in the beginning, or do I just start all over again?
Yeah, we would do it as an addition, and we're just filling in the gaps.
Okay. So as I'd mentioned, I was reviewing these reports that various consultants were submitting to the European Parliament on fisheries and aquaculture, and I thought, well, I can do this, and it felt like a natural continuation of the work I'd been doing up until that stage, and I really wanted to be involved in these interesting projects. But at the start, ASR was just me, and bit together with these other consultants. And then I worked with the Aquaculture Stewardship Council on revising their fish welfare standards. That's one of the big certifiers of seafood, well, aquatic foods in general, let's say. And then I worked with the Aquatic Life Institute, who are very focused on the mission of improving the lives of aquatic animals. And when I saw their model and their vision and their passion, of course, I'd already been working on fish welfare research. So it was an issue close to my heart, but I never thought about, dedicating my organization to it. So I think they inspired me to grow as well, and that's something I didn't mention earlier, but it definitely convinced me that animal welfare was a field that I was most interested in, and then one of the philanthropic funders encouraged me to seriously think about starting my own organization around, fish welfare. And they told me, well, why don't you submit a proposal for funding? And, they said, be ambitious, sky's the limit, like, what would you do with, X amount? And I actually did submit something that was I thought preposterous, but they actually liked it, and when I got the funding, which was a lot more than I was expecting, I was like, oh, okay, so now what? It was one of those moments. But it spurred me to then think about, well, okay, this is what I said I would do. How do I actually achieve that? And a month later, when I was in Zanzibar, like I was mentioning for this residency, being with other leaders and thinkers from across the continent, who many of them had their own organizations, it felt a lot more, achievable, for me. And I realized that it was time to start seriously thinking about growing ESR. And when I met this person that I mentioned in Kenya, who was looking for work and encouraged me to start a project there, we got talking, and then we realized there was an opportunity, a gap, let's say, to do good work there. And since my roots are from Africa, Egypt, it made sense to start there, and I'm glad that I did that because it's worked out so far. And I wanted to mention earlier, I never mentioned my background, but actually I'm an ecologist, so I'm an aquatic ecologist, and my background was in conservation, so marine biology type work. But a lot of people with marine biology degrees, they end up working in industry, either doing environmental assessments for, let's say, oil and gas, or renewable energy, or there's not that many jobs, unfortunately, in that world. So either just justifying industry's practices, or trying to mitigate the damage they cause. For me, it was fisheries and aquaculture. I worked a bit with fisheries, but then I realized how depressing the state of our oceans are, and the scale of the problems that you deal with. Like, you have to be quite, I think, thick-skinned to not be depressed by some of these issues. And then, of course, aquaculture was always touted as a solution, to overfishing, to depletion of the oceans. So I kind of started to slowly move in that direction. But again, I wasn't really comfortable in the aquaculture world because it tends to be a bit like agriculture in the sense of like very mathematical. You have this input and you get this output. And the idea of to think of animals as commodities, or inputs and outputs, didn't really sit well with me. And then my PhD supervisor at the UK at the time, she suggested to me to assess fish welfare in Egypt as part of a project that they were doing. I was like, oh, I never thought of animal welfare before. But as I started to get more into it and read about the various assessment frameworks and so on, it felt like a really natural continuation of my background in ecology, and it felt like a nice home. So you're in industry, you're not really kind of justifying it, but you're kind of still doing behavioral type research, and you can actually be building on the knowledge base that exists. So that's sort of how I got into animal welfare and fisheries and aquaculture, sorry, in particular. And I've just never looked back since, really. And there's just so much work to do to improve the lives of these animals. So we really need all hands on deck. Yeah.
Powerful examples of drawing on opportunities from various supporters and mentors, and also charting your own path and bringing different aspects of your experience together, recognizing tremendous need and finding ways to support and address those needs in spaces that, as we discussed, still need more research and more funding and more prioritization. Thank you so much for sharing that additional context.